While the other archetypes hit a snag, Domain surged and grabbed the checkered flag.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we walk through the second week of Aetherdrift Standard. Alrighty, folks, we went through and reviewed 12 major tournaments this past weekend, but none larger than Pro Tour Chicago. Now, given that Pro Tours eclipse other tournaments due to their hyper-competitive nature and inclusion of the best players currently in the game, we gave a lot of deference to them on this tier list, and on that note, Xur's Domain did come in first, both at the Pro Tour and overall, with 26 top 8s and 3 trophies. Now, Atraxa may not be the focal point anymore, but with the Verges coming in from Aetherdrift and Ride's End rounding out our removal, this deck is public enemy number 1 moving into week 3.
Wow, and Gruul Aggro came in second place with 24 top 8s and 3 trophies of its own. Now, while it failed to clinch a Pro Tour championship, the Mice of Bloomborough played a Tom and Jerry-esque game all weekend long with Domain, knocking several would-be contenders out of the running. Now, expect Gruul to continue its steady presence near the top, forcing everyone to treat it as the litmus test.
Esper Pixie came in third despite not making the top 8 of the Pro Tour. However, 21 copies of the deck made top 8s around the world this weekend, and a trophy was snagged as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, though.
Yeah, and rounding out Tier 1 is Mono Red Aggro. Now, Mono Red only managed 6 top 8s over the weekend, but it did snag 3 trophies, giving it the highest conversion rate this week and proving that perhaps the fast and furious deck from Aetherdrift was with us all along.
Tier 2 kicks off with Dimir Aggro as we wave farewell to Dimir Bounce from the tier list. 7 top 8s and 2 trophies over the weekend, especially when both of those trophies were won by the same player in back-to-back MTGO challenges, is a show of force. It might be time to dust off those fairy masterminds and get ready for war once more.
Ooh, and Jeskai Oculus came in 6th this weekend with 9 top 8s and a single trophy. At this point, I think we can safely say that Azorius has lost its footing, but apparently the solution was adding a third color to diversify the threat base. This build may remind you at times of Is It Phoenix and Pioneer, but have no fear, the eye in the sky still flies.
Golgari Midrange falls out of Tier 1 and into Tier 2 this week with 7 top 8s and a trophy. Now, while this was somewhat predictable given the rise of Domain, which traditionally shitstomps Golgari Midrange, there were a few Golgari variants that looked pretty spicy at the Pro Tour. We'll talk more on that in a little bit, though.
Omniscience combo returns on the back of 4 top 8s and a trophy. The builds continue to evolve, and this weekend was no exception. Get those Riptide Gear Hulks now if you're trying to keep up with the new builds.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll be taking a look at Is It Boom, the combo that threatened to take Pro Tour Chicago by force, and the new Temur Cauldron build, fresh off an RCQ win.
And I'll be highlighting the new build of Rakdos Midrange and Golgari Grave, an archetype that made it all the way to the top 8 of Pro Tour Chicago. But first, let's shift gears and fire off our Tier 1 breakdowns, beginning with Domain.
Matt Nass's return to the show was one of complete dominance as he smashed through the Swiss portion to be the first to lock his top 8 spot and an undisputed first seed. From there, he played his way through a couple mirror matches and proved why he remains one of the greatest minds in the game, and let's talk about this build. So if you look here, things you're going to notice. 1, there's no Cavern of Souls. Counterspells have never been more effective against Domain, especially this build. However, we have hard-hedged aggro, we have hard-hedged Pixie, and that's the point of this. As you look here, you see the 3 temporary lockdowns, the 2 Day of Judgments, and the Sunfall. You have staggered Wraths at various intervals, which makes it really hard for Pixie to figure out when they need to hold up Spell Pierce, when they can afford to do so, etc. Ride's End was a massive upgrade for this, and the Verges coming in also helped the mana base. That's really what this deck was missing before Aetherdrift. You didn't have a consistent mana base because you didn't have the Verges, not all of them anyway. And Ride's End, you needed it. You needed a 2-mana exile-based removal spell that triggered Beans, and we got it.
I love this deck's evolution. It certainly has picked up little pieces bit by bit with each set, Ride's End being one of the best ones lately. But my question for you, this deck's obviously going to become more popular this week because of the win, but what do you credit more for the rise of this deck recently? The win by Matt Nass, or just the overall performance it has in the matchups against the field?
I mean, I think Matt Nass's build is going to be the reason it rose to dominance, and it has been for most of this week. It's forcing new archetypes to emerge because of how dominant it's been against the aggro field that we've seen. And yeah, I'm going to credit the person who put it in the spotlight and kept it there. at times far longer than we wanted, as you may have noticed when we watched that mirror match in the finals that took forever. So yeah, it's been around. Thousands of people watched it dominate. So of course they're going to pick it up and they're going to keep playing with it. So yeah, I'm going to credit that with Matt on that one, because that's the reason everybody else got on board so quickly.
I couldn't agree more. And who could have guessed a double domain, final over there in the pro? That was wild. That was wild to watch. But I'll tell you who couldn't guess it. All the pilots of Gruul Aggro. Let's talk about Gruul Aggro.
Yuchen Liu made it to the semifinals of Pro Tour Chicago before finally falling to Domain. Nonetheless, their build of Gruul Aggro exemplified the evolution of the archetype perfectly, and let's talk about these numbers. So, you're seeing a 3-2 split of Innkeeper Sound to Questing Druid. That's the new norm. That's where your deck probably should be, folks, if you're playing Gruul Mice. The thing with Questing Druid in this build in particular is that it's a grindier build. You're not just trying to flop your hand out as fast as you can. So running a playset of Druid doesn't make sense here like it did for our team in Atlanta, whereas we were just trying to, velocity. This one's playing more of a chess game. And when you're playing that game, you like Innkeeper's Talent because it prevents you from having to overcommit to the board position. So you don't have to play into the Wraths as heavily. You can just say, okay, we're going to play Innkeeper's Talent, we're going to play a Heartfire Hero. That alone has to be answered. And if all you've got is a Wrath, you're spending it on a 1-for-1 there. And we're keeping the Innkeeper's Talent. Let's also note there's a 4-1 split of Torch the Tower and Burst Lightning in the main. I'm seeing the copies of Obliterating Bolt as well. Exile-based removal is just at an all-time high. It's been that way for a while. It's going to continue to be that way. And I think the acknowledgement that Obliterating Bolt needs to be in the deck is worthwhile right now, with all the Preachers running around, the Sentinels running around, Golgari had been rising. And just the mirror. Being able to kill something with 4 toughness matters in the mirror when you have Innkeeper's Talent on the other end. Sometimes you're not going to hit it right when it comes down, and Burst Lightning's not very good after Heartfire Hero gets pumped with an Innkeeper's Talent. Obliterating Bolt, on the other hand, handles that eloquently.
Right. Yeah, still a very powerful archetype. I have to ask though, everybody's asking about the domain matchup. So what would you consider some really key cards within this archetype for the domain matchup? I have to wonder when I look at this list where they are.
Sunspine Lynx is going to be a huge one. The ability to punish them for having a greedy mana base while simultaneously turning off further life gain until they answer that threat is huge. I think you're going to see somewhere between 2 to 4 copies in most Gruul sideboards moving forward as long as Domain is running around rampant. It also punishes the Esper Pixie's mana base, so you're going to want a couple copies for that alone. So right now, minimum 2 copies of Sunspine Lynx in the sideboard I think is appropriate for Gruul. You might play up to 4. It really depends on how slow you think those games are going to get and whether or not you want to play that route. Outside of that, it's really just about positioning and understanding where the board state's at and how hard you can commit or not commit based on what they've left open. So at a certain point, Max, it's just about getting the reps in. It's about learning the sequencing so you're not mis-sequencing left and right and playing into Wraths with double or triple threats. It's not easy, but that's what separates people in this game, is learning those sequences.
Learn your sequencing, get your reps in. That sounds like great advice from a coach. But let's talk about how the mighty have fallen. Esper Pixie.
All right, Michael McKeek Foster took down a 16-player RCQ in Washington, grabbing a trophy for the Pixies that struggled so heavily at the Pro Tour. Let's dive in. I mean, first and foremost, for people that are like, Pixie is dead, it didn't top 8 at the Pro Tour, wrong. It's not dead. It's still very much a tier 1 deck. Everybody was gunning for it at the Pro Tour. That was public enemy #1 going into that event, and everybody knew it, and thus it got gunned for really hard by all the pros, and we watched it falter because of that. To me, that's the sign of a balanced meta. If public enemy #1 can always be beaten, then there isn't a best deck. There's just a balanced metagame with, somewhere between 3 to 5 decks at the top, and which one you're going to want to play kind of depends week to week on who's gunning for you. So Pixies, not a good call for the Pro Tour. Might be a good call in a week or two here when Domain is running rampant and everybody else has forgotten about Pixies. So I think you're going to have that scenario where Pixie decks are set up to struggle right now with this build, for instance, with Domain. But I do think you can shift that, and I disagree with everybody who's saying Pixie is dead. I think there are ways to shift the Domain matchup massively.
Okay. And, aside from that, all the people saying the archetype is dead, we're starting to see some of those pilots shift over to Orzhov Pixie. Now, can you tell the audience a little bit about why that's happening?
So Orzhov Pixie is kind of set up to be a mirror breaker while simultaneously having way better game against Gruul Aggro. And that's been the issue with Esper Pixies. You have a very painful mana base. Some of the games you're taking like somewhere between 3 to 7 points from your mana base. And that's fine if you're always in the driver's seat and you're always ahead on tempo, but it's damning if you get behind, which has been an issue for Esper Pixies in the past, especially in a Gruul matchup where they go under you. You're not necessarily the fastest deck in the room. You're going up against a red-based aggro deck. They're going to be able to play, converted mana cost for a converted mana cost, an equal game, which is not where you want to be when you're trying to get under people. So I think the Orzhov deck does a really good job of acknowledging that and saying, okay, we can play Temporary Lockdown. We can play that game. We can bounce that back with Pixie. We don't necessarily need to fear the lockdowns hitting our stuff. We can use that as card advantage, and we can use that to really emphasize Momentum Breakers, Hopeless Nightmares, Grim Baubles, Nowhere to Runs. Like, all of these get trapped under that and then come right back out. So I like that this is trying to abuse the Temporary Lockdown cycle, essentially. And that's really the differentiating factor.
Wow. Yeah. I have a fear, though, that we're just going to end up seeing both decks on the ladder next week on the tier list. But let's see what happens. I'll be interested to see how this weekend's events pan out for both of those archetypes. All right. Let's talk about the last deck in our tier 1 archetypes. Mono Red Aggro.
There was one team at the Pro Tour that called the Rise of Domain and pushed back by playing an old-fashioned Get 'em Dead Red build that loses all the grind in exchange for a hyper-aggressive game plan that's damnably difficult to contain. Now, Ian Robb was rewarded with a top 8 for the gamble, and on a personal note, well fucking played. Now, as to the build, you're going to look here and you're going to see what we saw about 2-3 months ago. It's about the same list from about 3 months ago, where you're just, okay, Swift Spears are back, Burst Lightnings are a playset, Lightning Strikes are a playset. We've got a couple Witchstalker Frenzies, and really the biggest shift is we're playing the 3 Soulstone Sanctuaries in the main. But 7 utility lands makes for a lot of grind, despite this not having Questing Druids, despite this not having Innkeeper's Talents. You get a lot of grind out of your lands here, which is great. It also makes the 4 Sunspine Links in the sideboard that much more damning. Like, if you are looking for a deck that is aggro, that is set up to beat the crap out of Domain, this one's pretty well boarded for that. Like, it's got what you want if you're trying to go that route.
Wow, yeah, it wants to hit you in the face. It doesn't want to use like Obliterating Bolt to kill your creature. It wants to hit you in the face. So very interesting. I love the very direct aggression here. Now, you talked about the utility lands a little bit here. In the past, we've sort of talked about how many of these are appropriate. Do you think 3 Soulstone Sanctuaries are appropriate for this deck?
In mono red, yes. If we're talking Gruul, absolutely not. Part of the issue with Gruul's mana base is that you're trying to put too many demands upon it. So if you try to go with multiple Soulstone Sanctuaries, you end up with scenarios where you don't have the green source of mana because you can't turn on the Verge, and that's problematic. In this scenario, you look at it, there's 15 mountains. All right, so you have over a 90% chance to have an untapped red source on turn 1. And you might be thinking, well, I want to be able to play multiple red spells on turn 2 or turn 3. That's fine, because we have Rockface Village, and so many cards that you are playing are creatures. Rockface Villages kind of offset that issue because you have 18 sources of red, which is enough for a double spell on turn 3, as long as one of them is a creature. So I think you're fine working within those constraints because Soulstone Sanctuary gives you so much reach. And let's remember why Soulstone Sanctuary is so important. Is Leyline Binding doesn't hit it. This town ain't big enough, doesn't hit it. Like, it does get bonuses from the mice, too. Like Manifold Mouse, it is a mouse. It's a shapeshifter, right? So you do get a 3/3 double strike with a Manifold Mouse and a Soulstone. And that's pretty damn good when you have Vigilance as well, making Ride's End a lot harder to cast.
Yeah, 12 mouse package plus the soul stones and the fact that it can't be targeted by certain things like Leyline Binding. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, wow. Ooh, this is certainly a deck to be not to be messed with. But that does it for our tier 1 archetypes. I'm going to go ahead and go down into tier 2 and kick things off with Dimir Aggro. Hamida took down back-to-back MTGO challenges this past Saturday with Dimir Aggro, highlighting that this archetype certainly isn't dead yet. Let's discuss why. Now, I want to mention here, we have to talk about Domain's rising position. The way that it's surging really positions this deck well. Domain traditionally favored. We're traditionally favored against that matchup, and so I believe that we might see this deck in tier 1 next week. Tempo overall tends to position well against ramp decks, especially when you have access, like in this archetype, to hand disruption and counter spells. Now, that being said, that leads me to talk about Deep Cavern Bat. Deep Cavern Bat has been one of my longtime favorites in this archetype. I always try to advocate for it in a meta where you're dealing with combo decks, you're dealing with ramp decks, decks that have the one thing that they really want to do. Deep Cavern Bat, great disruption. And then also, it's not a hyper aggressive meta right now, but we are still dealing with some aggro decks. So you've got Gix's Command in the main as a great hedge against aggro, and I think that's the right choice.
So Max, I look at this list and it's got most of the classics. I love, like you said, the Deep Cavern Bats are sitting in there. Do we want Harvester of Misery in that sideboard, though? I noticed that there were no copies, and that's what do you think? What do you think?
I think we got to make room for that card. I mean, main board, we've got 8 pieces of early game removal. We're looking a lot like Golgari, known to, really single target removal things with that many pieces of removal. At least have it in the sideboard to supplement, the anti-aggro hedge here. I think that's a good choice, a good idea, at least, a couple copies. I also don't mind running 1 or 2 alongside copy of Gix's Command. Gix's Command, of course, has a mode where you can retrieve it. So, I think it functions and it's positioned really well here. So yeah, I recommend at least a couple copies in the sideboard.
All about that value, and Harvester of Misery in a black-based mid-range deck is just a good call lately. That said, let's take a look at the other side of the spectrum and the eye in the sky, Oculus.
Oh boy, we went to a third color here, and Kenta Harane made it to the top 8 of the Pro Tour Chicago with the newly evolved Jeskai Oculus. The pivot into red paid massive dividends for the eye in the sky. Let's talk about why. So, full set of Torch the Tower, premium 1 mana removal. This deck needed it. I just, the Azorius Oculus deck really couldn't respond in the early game to some of the threats that we're dealing with now in this aggressive meta. We've got NT and FOMO, and I like both of those cards for the discard. Typically you see these in like the Delirium deck, right? But it serves a great function here, helping us to get that Oculus in the graveyard, get it back out. It also gives you a plan B, puts pressure on the opponent very quickly, and you need that in this meta where you're dealing with ramp, combo, a variety of different archetypes. You got to be able to apply pressure early. Bitter Reunion gives your creatures haste. Don't forget about that mode. And post board, having 4 quick wrath effects, that's going to help you contain the swarm strategies, and that's really a must right now. So I like where this deck is positioned with the third color.
Yeah, I think it did a really good job of stating that when it comes to this deck, if you can handle the Oculus, you still have to handle Proft. And Proft will just turn those Steam Core Scholars into nightmares really, really quickly. Here's my issue, though. I look at that sideboard, I see Chandra, Spark Hunter. Can we do better than that?
Yeah, there was some discussion this week about this card in the Rebellion, and I'm on the side of trying to find alternatives to that. I took a look at some of the results from this past week. I did notice that someone took down, I can't recall who, but an MTGO league with with this deck, but they were using a combination of Guardian of Nubenalia, which you can discard cards to protect, Scrapwork Mutt, and Phyrexian Dragon Engine, and those both have Unearth. So they got some recursive power. If you want to be aggressive, which I assume the 2 reasons you want to play Chandra is to be aggressive and get cards into your graveyard. And those cards do both, especially Phyrexian Dragon Engine when it comes back in with the Unearth ability. So Unearth, great ability, gets around sweepers as well. Don't forget that. I've also heard that as a justification for Chandra, that, creating vehicles that get around sweepers. But honestly, I'd rather lean on tuning the deck more with a combination of these sorts of solutions.
That's fair. Speaking of a deck that is also tuning up with a variety of solutions, let's talk about Golgari Midrange.
Valentino, sorry if I butchered this, Valentino Bisogno, that's how I'm going to pronounce it, 1-8, 20-player RCQ in Italy over the weekend with Golgari Midrange, taking down the classic Dimir Aggro in the finals. Here's where the archetype is currently positioned. We are on Debris Beetle. We've got a couple of copies of Debris Beetle in here. Hot new 4-drop, now in the main, replaces Sheldred, very aggressive card. Pretty close, you would think, to something like Ball Lightning. Especially against a wrath-heavy domain deck in Game 1, this is going to win you some Game 1s against domain, and I like that. A couple of copies of Anoint with Affliction back in the main. Strong hedge against both Gruul and now Oculus, right? This is just a prime card against Oculus, so you got to have that now that deck is back. And we've also maintained sort of the anti-Pixie elements with Sentinel and Thrun in the main, along with, let's not forget, the 3 Balos in the sideboard. I think those have they're just pretty much cemented there as long as Pixie is a thing, I think.
Yeah. And honestly, I look at this this list, Max, and I think it's probably going to beat most of the aggro decks, right? Like, it's set up to beat these aggro decks, but how the hell are we beating Domain with this?
Yeah, that's the thought in the room right now when we're talking about Golgari Midrange is folks are trying to tune it for that matchup. I just, where it's positioned right now, there might be a solution. I just don't see it, right? We've already included a ton of enchantment removal. It has access to great enchantment removal. You have access to Fade to History. I'm not seeing that enough in the sideboards of Golgari decks, but you could turn to that card. I just don't think that all that anti-enchantment is enough. This deck, Domain, has a way to snowball, even when you get it down to 0, even when you exile their creatures. It's a tough deck to deal with. This deck, the way it's positioned, is already super hedged against the aggro matchups. So I think we take points away from that, which is more of a sure thing that you want against the aggro, and you're granting that to the Domain matchup. And it's one of those classic cases of if you can only be mildly good against everything in the field, you really ought to just tune to be really great against a few or the majority of the field if you can. So I think that's the situation we have here. I think Golgari players just need to watch out for Domain being in their local metas. I think that's the only solution here.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, you can hard hedge for Domain, but at a certain point, you start losing against everything else. So, it's a metagame where you just have to shoot your shot and decide what are you going to play against and what's positioned well against that. And that's Magic in a nutshell anyway. But
Yeah.
speaking of decks that nobody probably prepares for, Omniscience.
Man, I get nervous every time I have to talk about this deck, but Parsec beat Domain in the finals of a 69-player MTGO challenge on Sunday with the Omni Combo. Now, their build followed the update that we saw in the Pro Tour. This deck has been tuning and shifting in the background until, it could really strike at the meta, and I think it finally has. This has solidified the next phase in the evolution for the archetype. We've got 3 copies of Stock Up. That is go get your copies of Stock Up while you can. I'm telling you, the price on this card is going up for multiple archetypes. You get to dig, you get value. It's really a compelling card to play. The only downside is that the cards go in the bottom of your library, not in the graveyards, but whatever. I still think it's a really valuable card. We're on 4 temporary lockdowns in the 75. This is a thing. I mean, the deck wants to delay in the early game. It's really all it can do until it gets the combo off. And the new darling, we thought we were only going to be playing with Oil Deep Gear Hulk in this meta, but 3 Riptide Gear Hulks, now a sideboard staple. Life's just a little bit easier when you have that threat that tempo's problematic permanence out, and this is exactly what the deck wants to use. It's really a strong plan B.
Yeah, it helps that Riptide Gear Hulk is an artifact as well, so Abuelos just goes, all right, screw it, we'll just take a Gear Hulk and put it back in. Like, it's a 1/1, but it's still got double strike and prowess, so, we're okay with flying double strike prowess on a deck filled with instants and sorceries. Why not? But I look at this, Max, and I have to ask, do we want another, Wishboard win con in the sideboard beyond what we have here?
Yeah, I got asked this question a few weeks back, and I had a totally different answer that I'm going to say now. I don't think we do. I think early on I misunderstood this deck, but I realized after watching some games with it, doing my research, you only really need the 1 creature to copy, and if you don't have it, Sunder the Gateway is a card in the wish board that can provide that. Even without that card, though, you can still copy the token you have with Abuelo's Awakening. I think the deck should really just focus instead on tuning against the disruption of the combo, right? You got to worry about your Tide Binders. You got to worry about your aggro matchups that get underneath. And then we also have a deck that we haven't talked about really today yet, but Azorius Control on the horizon. So, it's going to face some issues comboing off with counter spells and different forms of disruption coming back into the meta.
Yeah, it's not an easy path for Omniscience, but to be fair, it shouldn't be. That deck, if it's if it's easy for that deck to win, the format's broken, right? It needs to be a tier 1.5 deck, or we have a very unbalanced scenario. And I'll just say this. First of all, folks, buy Stock Up. It's in Vintage, it's in Legacy, it's in Modern, it's in every damn format. Buy 4. They're $4 right now. They're going to be $10 soon if it keeps going.
Yep.
Just get them. it's what you're going to need. The Gear Hulks, yeah, they're worth picking up. They're still like $10. Grab those two if you want to play Omniscience. But keep an eye on Omniscience because we don't have a rotation anytime soon, and combo decks only get stronger as you get additional cards. So this is one you keep an eye on, honestly, because Omniscience is the biggest combo in the format. That being said, let's move things forward. Let's talk a little bit about the Brewer's Corner. Love this segment every week. Max, kick things off. Tell us about Rakdos Midrange.
All right. Rakdos might be back. This iteration is by Kokawa Tsunao, who top aided a 45-player Emperor of Standard tourney in Japan last Saturday. What you're trying to do with this deck is be aggressive. It's what Rakdos does best. This deck presents an aggressive, hasty game plan, and it also has the Annex package with 3 Archfiends of the Dross. So, what's not to love about being able to play those? Gastel Thrill Roller supplements Preacher pretty well. I just want to say in the 3 mana value slot, your tokens from your Preacher can eventually crew the vehicle. After the initial, hasty run, you can keep the aggression going, and vehicles dodge board wipes. In the 2 mana value slot, we've also got Gastel Thrill Seeker, which supplements its 2 mana value companion in FOMO, pinging your opponent every time it attacks, and FOMO eventually can make you attack twice in a turn. So that's really going to drain your opponent over time. So we've got some hedging here against aggressive swarm strategies as well in the sideboard, and we've really, honestly, I just want to say we've got a decent shell in our hands here. I think Rakdos is probably really well positioned to handle the Annex package, so be on the lookout for Rakdos.
Absolutely. We're going to move things forward, though, and talk about the deck that threatened Pro Tour Chicago. Is it Boom? Apologize if I butcher this name. Remy Rodier at Pro Tour Chicago went 7-3 with this pile of cards. And I know you look at it and you're like, how? Well, to put it bluntly, Boom Mobile allows this deck, when combined with a few other cards, specifically Radiant Lotus and Enigma Jewel, to go off on turn 5 for, I believe it's over 30 damage if you have enough artifacts to pull it off. But that's like the backup plan. It's weird because it's got a value plan here with these synthesizers of let's just play big fat Durples, right? Like we just play artifacts, we just play big fat Durples, and they gave us Birthing Pod for artifacts. So you knew this was eventually going to lead into something. We weren't sure where it was going to end up, but the fact that it can go, repurposing Bay, shoving Legion Extruders, which are killing creatures on impact, into more synthesizers is amazing. Being able to go up even further into Boom Mobile is great, and the fact that you can cheat out these Memory Guardians for way less than 5 and then just flip them into a Radiant Lotus allows you to go off quickly. This deck is damage-based removal at the low end, which is a little concerning because if they get out from under you, you're not catching up. But at the same time, if it contains the early game and they don't have enough ways to interact with your artifacts, this deck's really hard to beat.
Repurposing Bay was the piece this deck needed. I think those decks needed. And quite honestly, when I play against this deck, it's very common, more often than you think, for them to get out 4 copies of the card on the board. So it does get silly after a while as the game goes on. But let's go ahead and launch into the one I want to present to you, Golgari Grave. This iteration is by Zevin Faust, top aided PT Chicago. Let's just point out why Golgari is alive again. You're going to start to see some experimentation in this color wheel. The new Verge, Wastewood Verge, is here, and it's already enabling some experimentation within the Golgari colors. This is a graveyard deck that uses beans. Wow. And several cards that become cheaper as you fill your graveyard, and that's how it's a beans deck. I mean, this can get crazy out of hand. You've got Overwhelming Remorse, which can exile a creature or a planeswalker. You've got Cheatin Gravestalker, which is a 5/4 body with cycling. You've got Huskburster Swarm, which doesn't care if you get your graveyard exiled. You've got Hollow Marauder, providing a strong evasive body that also makes your opponent discard a card. And let's not forget, Soul to the Lost scales as the match wears on. So that's wow, very very tight shell here. In the sideboard, we're also hedged against aggro with, and swarm decks with Terror Tide. So don't forget about that board wipe as well.
Yeah, how the mighty have fallen. We used to have Dredge, now we've got this. I miss the old days, I'll put it that way, but at the same time, this was a spicy number. It was well positioned. It was there to beat the crap out of Pixie and Gruul, and it did that all weekend long. It's not going to be great against Domain. Just going to go ahead and put that out there. We've tried 3 different builds of Golgari within the team this week. And I can tell you Golgari Obliterator, Golgari Grave, and Golgari Midrange. Not one of them managed to hit positive win records against Domain. It's just tough. It's just tough. But if you're in a very aggro meta, that is where you want to be. Like, if I'm expecting Gruul and Pixie, and I have the money to shell out for 4 Overlord of the Baelmerk, RIP your bank account, those are like $40 a piece now. But, let's say you've got the money for that, and you got the money for the Underground Mortuaries, which I assume are also at least $10 a piece, if not more, because all the Surveil lands are. Then, yeah, this is a good call. This is a good call for that. But we're going to move it along and talk a little bit about Dimir Cauldron. Shout out to Zach Mandelblatt, first place of a 24-player RCQ in Oregon last Saturday. Dimir Cauldron, baby. I've been waiting to see the right build of this deck. I couldn't figure it out myself. I tried a bunch of different builds. I like this one a lot. This one does what it's supposed to do, and it focuses on that, which I think is something the prior builds struggled with. They were always trying to divide and conquer with different strategies, and this one goes, no, we're just an exhaust deck. That's it. That's the point of this. We're not trying to infinite combo. We're not trying to do any of that. There's no Sleep Cursed Fairy. Just we're here for the value engine that is Draconautics Engineer, Afterburner Expert, and Loot. And everything we're doing is trying to put one of those under a Soul Cauldron so that all our creatures gain those abilities. To that end, I like that there's 4 Molt Tender. This card, I think, has been criminally ignored for the most part, and we've seen it now in back-to-back Brewer's Corner decks for a reason. It's better than you think. It's not Deathrite Shaman. I'm not going to pretend it's Deathrite Shaman, but it's good. It's really, really strong for these mill-based strategies. So, worth examining. Pick up your 4 today. And that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, once more, we looked at 12 archetypes in our recap. What are you playing going into Week 3 of Aetherdrift Standard?
All right, so Domain, I expect to surge, which means I'm going to go in the opposite direction and play Jeskai Convoke. So assuming Domain does surge, whether it's in the overall meta or your local meta, we want to go low. This deck has a Swarm strategy, that much is obvious. Historically, this gets underneath Domain in whatever version is out there right now, and Jeskai are the colors because we've got access to 2 copies of Spell Pierce, 2 copies of Protect the Negotiators. That really helps us get around sweepers, and it's as easy as that. That's why those are in there. Nesting Bot also gives us more artifact targets for our Gleeful Demolitions, even when they get removed. And then 21 land base, probably what we're settled on. I've got a single Mirax. I don't want to go higher than 1 here because we've got a complicated mana base. Not using the Verges. We need to get the right color early, from turn 1, and we have very few basics to allow those Verges to really flourish. So this is the form of the deck right now. This is what I've settled on over Boros. We've got 3 copies of Destroy Evil for the lockdowns. Lockdowns are trending, so just beware of those. And, sideboard correctly for your matchups.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you look at the meta, Max, and you say Domain's public enemy number 1, and I think we can say that after the Pro Tour at least, this is definitely one path, right? You go under, you say, okay, we're going to go Swarm, we're going to force you to resolve Wrath effects, or else we are going to beat you. And that is one very specific path. I love it. It's a great way to go. On the other end of the spectrum, we're going to look at what I'm actually looking at this weekend, which is Azorius Control. So, Arne Huschenbeth did really well at the Pro Tour with Azorius Control because they called as well that Domain was going to be there and going to be there in some numbers. So they said, okay, if we're going to go that route, we are going to prep this list to beat the crap out of Domain. You know what Domain really struggles with, Max? It struggles with 4 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind. It is not easy to contain this card. Also, once more, 4 stock up. Remember how we talked about that? Yep, this card is going to be everywhere. This is an incredibly efficient way to go find more copies of Jace the Perfected Mind. And that's what we're doing against them. I mean, fundamentally, we're just saying, okay, you're going to play a game that can outgrind, outvalue everybody, but you're going to run out of cards. And we want you to resolve those beans. You can have the beans. We're not going to play a counter war over them. We're also not really playing any permanents that care about anything you're doing. Like, we're just interacting minimally until the day we get to go Jace minus game. And that's really what this deck does. It just says we're going to wrath the board. We're going to keep things, locked down until we can eventually mill you out. It's a hell of a gamble, but I think it's the right one right now. If you see a lot of Domain in your meta, this deck just pounds right through it. I have not seen a lot of Domain players that have been able to shift, and that's the issue with an established meta, right? You get to a place where if you want to beat Domain, you can play a deck like this. But if Domain wants to beat you, they have to lose all these points against Pixie and Gruul Aggro in order to do that, and then they open themselves up to getting hit from the other side with decks like Jeskai Convoke. So it's kind of that wombo combo 1-2 punch of saying you can't beat everything, you have to pick what you want to beat. So pick wisely for your metagame. And this to me is a really wise choice because I don't think anyone's gunning for control this week.
What's intriguing to me is that as soon as one deck kind of not necessarily steps out, but steps down, like something else comes in to fill its place, right? So the target on the back, that's an important thing week to week. With Domain having the target on its back and, Pixie kind of trending slightly downward, there's room for something like Azorius Control to come back. And with stock up, that might have been the piece that it needed. So we'll see what next week looks like. Be sure to tune in. But that about does it. Now, I want to announce we did hold our Rebellion team qualifier last week. I want to say congratulations to the 8 new guild mages who joined the others to form our 16-person team, the Rebellion. Now, expect to see our colors in places like Hartford, Denver, Minneapolis, Charlotte, and many more big events this year as the Rebellion really poises to take over.
And last but not least, please like, share, and comment on this video to show support for your community. We appreciate having all of you here. And until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.